Alright, what is good, everybody? First video of 2024. Happy New Year to all of you watching. Obviously, the 2024 tennis season was underway even before 2023 wrapped up. The tennis season, obviously, so far has a really refreshing air about it, with so many of the biggest stars coming back on both the ATP and the WTA. We'll obviously get into that, but, before we really got into the meat and potatoes of the Australian summer, I still needed to get in a little bit of 2023 review action, and also get my 2024 predictions off before things really got going with the Australian Open and whatnot. So, let's just get some predictions on the record right here. What better place to start regarding that than my end-of-year top 10 predictions for 2023 at the end of 2022? And I've got to say, it's sort of a tale of two halves. I think at the top 5 half, I did reasonably well. Obviously, the top two, the only two names I got right on the money with their correct position, Djokovic and Alcaraz at 1 and 2 respectively. I expected the bounce back year for Medvedev. I was one off there for him. Tsitsipas definitely had a worse year than I anticipated, but still one position off for him as well. Obviously, I don't think anybody could have anticipated 2023 being a year where Rafa Nadal only played all of 4 matches, I want to say, for the year. So obviously, way off the mark there, but overall top half, can't feel too bad about it. That bottom half, though, is a completely different story. I'll start with the two takes that kind of hung over my head all year long. I was thinking about these and just how laughably off they were the entire year. On one hand, Andrei Rublev, I don't really know what had gotten into me saying he'd be out of the top 10 entirely. I would have gotten, maybe not top 8. And even that, a bit of a stretch given just how consistent he is and just how rare his type of year-round consistency is even in the top 10. Obviously, especially after your tier 1 guys. But he not only stayed top 8, he did one better. He finished top 5 and responded with the best year of his career. So obviously got to take my L there. The other one was Matteo Berrettini. I really thought that we were going to get 2021 Matteo Berrettini, and really from the off and throughout the entire year when he was playing, it was a mess physically, never really got healthy, and it definitely seemed like that wore on his confidence. All year long, he was very poor, really, aside from Wimbledon. That was the one really very good result he had all year, a couple of really good wins there, but aside from that, laughably off the mark for me. I definitely underestimated how big the durability factor would be with Berrettini. Of course, in there you've got your Holger. That was the one in this bottom half that, I wasn't too far off with. I had him at 9, he ended 8. And then Ruud and Felix. I had a segment in my preseason video last year, I think, where I pondered on some of these guys, who's here to stay and who's going to have trouble maintaining. Obviously, where I had these two guys, I expected them to be ones that were here to stay. I don't think those were necessarily bad calls, especially on Casper's part. For Felix, maybe there was some overlooking of still present, streakiness, consistency issues, just because it did feel like he took a reasonably big leap last year, which he did. Health was obviously a struggle for him. Casper kind of just felt like he had that sophomore slump after a big breakthrough. And then I definitely undersold how much I thought Sinner would climb. Although I suppose I still had him climbing a decent amount, because even though I think he had a pretty good 2022, he ended the year 15 just because I believe injuries saw him miss a decent amount of time interspersed throughout the year. So I guess not really a terrible call there. I guess some of the names ahead of him were a bit questionable, but, hindsight's 2020. And we're going to shoot to do better this year. So now that we've become familiarized with our top 10, let's just go down the line, hand each of these players a grade for their season. Start up top, very easy A+. 2 years after a mind-boggling age 34 3-slam season, Novak Djokovic 2 years later basically won up to that season at age 36. In 2023, it was very much the Novak Djokovic revenge tour. I think a lot of us felt he was primed for a huge year. Obviously, the guy just loves shooting for these targets, and any chip on the shoulder you give him for motivation, he was always going to welcome that with open arms. And certainly, him being allowed to play at most of these events aside from the spring, US hard courts, him being back basically everywhere else, he was a man on a mission. And by the numbers and, just watching him, in many ways he was as dominant as ever. Among his 4 3-slam seasons now, this was the year he dropped the fewest amount of sets across those 3-slam wins. Obviously, eye test wise, he's just so in control of every component of his game right now. This Neo Djokovic serve has remained an immense asset. His net play seems to sharpen every successive time you see him, and this year his forehand was as explosive as it's ever been. And, all of that in conjunction with him tactically obviously being the mastermind that he is, it allowed him to not only win easier than he was, 2 years ago, where those slam wins were obviously a lot more effortful, and as a result, it allowed him to bring it outside of the slams more than we've seen from him in a while, really. 2 Masters in Cincy and Paris, and then, of course, taking out the Tour Finals. And each and every one of those wins, it felt like, just extended or set a new record. Obviously, got the major lead in Paris and extended it at the US Open. I think a really underrated one is extending his Masters lead. Just a ridiculous tally of 40 Masters titles with the Paris one. And then, of course, ending the year breaking the tie with Roger Federer for most Tour Finals titles. So all this goes to say, obvious A+, whatever you want to say. Banner year for Novak Djokovic, one of the best of his career. On to Carlos Alcaraz. I'm going to give him a solid A. It was a very easy, obvious A+ through Wimbledon. His year obviously started off a bit late with him unable to play Australia, and still, he had to iron out some minor health issues early in his comeback. But through Wimbledon, obviously, he was an absolute bulldozer, went deep everywhere he played, won, more than half of everywhere he played to that point through the first 3 slams of the year. And honestly, given the way that Wimbledon final played out, the way that Alcaraz won it, I'm 100% serious when I say he could have not won a match the rest of the year, and he would have still gotten this A. That win pretty much stamped him as the guy that a lot of us have hailed him to be in his meteoric rise over these last couple of years. And when you have a breakthrough like that, it's only natural. You see it all the time in sports where, athletes have a little bit of an adjustment period to, I guess, a sort of new territory. And it's not like the end of his year was poor at all. Post Wimbledon, he was just making quarters and semis instead of winning titles and going to finals at almost every event he played. I think obviously he improved as a player from last year, and he was already at such a great place at the end of 2022. The only thing I'd say is obviously he plays a little bit of a brash play style, and as a result it feels like that's of course part and parcel for why he's so exciting, what makes him what he is. But occasionally it does feel like that kind of gets in the way of him managing himself, preserving himself better within these matches where, whether it's within matches or within the season where you see a little bit of burnout. Feels like some of that can be tied back to that, but I'm sure that'll come with time. Overall, you gotta feel great about him at the end of this year heading into 2024 with his first Australian Open as a top dog ahead of him. Of course, next at number 3, we had Daniil Medvedev. I'd hang around A-, B+ territory on Medvedev's year. Relative to expectations, at the end of 2022, the expectation was to show that 2022 season was more of the fluke, the aberration. Because even at the beginning of this year, after Australia, Daniil was at a bit of a crossroads where you could have been forgiven for wondering if he had already peaked. And almost immediately after that, he resoundingly responded. I think start to finish, maybe 2021 is in that conversation, but arguably Medvedev's best year consistency-wise from a week in, week out standpoint. Only real disappointing result was Roland Garros, and that too because he had easily his best clay court season of his career. The year obviously saw him capture 2 big titles in Rome and Miami. Kind of strange because he showed more aptitude than ever on the slower surfaces, hard courts and clay, than he ever had before. Even grass, a surface he's not particularly comfortable on, made the semis there, his best result at Wimbledon. And then a little bit of a disappointing North American hardcourt summer for his standards. But of course he was able to redeem it with that US Open performance. I think that semifinal against Alcaraz, as impressive a performance as Medvedev has ever had. The year in isolation, it was phenomenal, and Medvedev definitely reestablished himself as one of those tier 1 guys, particularly on hard courts. That being said, with him moving forward, it does seem like he's going to, pretty soon have to reinvent himself a little bit, because a lot of the guys that he's going to be seeing at the business end of these tournaments have really begun to effectively employ the playbook on Medvedev. For like 99% of people on tour, employing that playbook is not going to be effective. But Djokovic has basically gotten it down to a science in the big matches against Daniil since that 2021 Paris final, showed that on full display in the US Open, and now pretty noteworthily Sinner from 6-0 trailing in the head-to-head has won 3 in a row at the end of the year. He got the big one on Alcaraz at the US Open, playing about as well as he can, but I think we're all on the same page that even Carlos is still a terrible matchup for him. And I think it's gotten to the point where, staying the course, Medvedev will remain a top 5 player, no doubt about it. Assuming health permits, of course. I don't think he's at the age where physical decline is going to play much of a factor there either. But as far as prospects of winning another slam, definitely think the tactics and tendencies, particularly that return of serve, probably going to need a little bit of an adjustment. But as far as just 2023, he was excellent. I think I'd also go in the same realm of A-, B+, borderline there for Jannik Sinner. Obviously, Sinner showed the biggest bit of improvement we've seen from him throughout the course of this season, and it really crescendoed at the end of the year. My thoughts on his close to the year, obviously pretty well documented in my last video. Genuinely super impressive to be able to move the needle the way that Sinner did in that time of year. Obviously, the questions now are pretty much just for him to translate it to best of 5. And, of course, not fall victim to others in past years who have finished the year so strong, just to kind of flop afterwards. It typically is very hard to translate that success, that type of dominant run, into a new year. I am sold that Sinner is a transformed player. As I said, I'm sold his upside is a lot higher than I had initially anticipated. Pretty much now we just got to see it in best of 5. As far as his year was concerned, obviously checked off a lot of boxes. Obviously first big title, first major semifinal. If there was one thing to, shine the light on a little about his year, it would be, a little bit of a disappointing slam season. Particularly the French. Obviously with that draw, I think he easily could have gone to the semis, even final. And then of course the US Open, he was riding so high. Not a bad loss there, just more of a stinging one because he definitely felt he could have done damage there. And then of course ending the year, getting these signature wins, faring better against the top 10 than he ever had before by a long shot. And yeah, it definitely seems like big things are on the horizon for him. Andrei Rublev at number 5. This was definitely a year I had a lot of respect for. Obviously, as I said earlier in the video, my arrow was pointed down on Rublev at the end of last year. Really, I think just by virtue of stagnation, but that stagnation was non-existent this year. In 2023, Rublev posted the best season of his career, obviously conquered his first big title, Masters win in Monte Carlo. Although the year didn't start out great, eventually we returned to the typical year-round consistency of Andrei Rublev. Another 3 quarterfinals at the majors to add, of course, onto that streak of, consecutive quarterfinals without finally breaking through to a semi. But the important thing for Andre is, he's still putting himself in position there, and this year it really seemed like he did everything in his power to, do something different, make a change in some of the dynamics that have haunted him against the very best of the best. This year, he definitely seemed much more comfortable working points, trusting himself to defend more than he ever had before. More and better than he ever had before. And I'm really glad that he was rewarded with his first big title, at least this year, for those efforts. I thought it was really impressive. The way he added another layer of depth to his game this year, in a way I didn't really think he was capable of. And so I have to say, everything that he won this year, finishing the year top 5, it all seems extremely well earned. In Andre's case, while it may seem that, he's always going to be lacking that little extra something to actually win a major, just the fact that he was able to further elevate his ceiling this way, I think that's super noteworthy. And it goes without saying, he's elevated that ceiling to a pretty darn good place regardless. So I give Andrei Rublev a B+. So at this point it's taking long enough, so I'm just going to speed run through the back end of this top 10 and get to 2024 predictions. At number 6, Stefanos Tsitsipas. He gets a C+ from me. Really good in Australia as usual. Somehow in the totality of his year, this was the most wins he's ever had at majors. But nonetheless, a very mediocre year the rest of the way. And also one that felt the most injury ravaged yet for him. His flaws are his flaws, but even with them seeming to go nowhere, in the past it's felt like he has been a higher caliber player than he was throughout the course of this year. So for him, you probably hope for just a more healthy 2024. But in the grand scheme of things, it continues to feel like he has stagnated, if not regressed slightly. Alexander Zverev, by the end, he looked almost back to the player he resembled pre-ankle injury at Roland Garros. I don't think quite there, but to a level certainly where I think that it's pretty evident that he has enough in the tank to once again occupy one of those top 5 slots the way he has for the better part of the last 6+ years. We kind of know who that player is. Mainly, I feel his limitations are mental, assuming he's back or around near back to what he was pre-injury. To an extent, he seems to have cleaned up his second serve yips a little bit. Again, his flaws are his flaws, but it is to be commended how quickly he got back to this level, especially the second half of the year. And he looks poised to again be, the typical fabulous year-round performer that he is. So for that, he gets a B. Number 8, Holger Rune. When he found his footing this year during the clay court season through Wimbledon, he was excellent. Legitimately one of the top 4 or 5 players in the world in that span. He was okay before that to start the year, and then after that, he was pretty bad, really until, indoor season again. For him at this point, it just all seems tied to he goes as his endurance and durability goes. And the physicality aspect for him is obviously still a work in progress. It'll be interesting to see how he does, the proven super coach now in Boris Becker. And he is super young, so I'm sure that will be addressed. And eventually it'll come around. And overall, I do think a pretty solid follow-up to his breakthrough at the end of 2022. I'll say B- for Holger's 2023. Number 9, Hubie Hurkacz. One of the most confusing players to me on tour. And he was super mediocre all year, up until really Wimbledon. For most of the year, whenever I watched Hubie, I felt like, serve aside, which, his serve is the most potent on tour statistically right now, But I was wondering throughout the years, like, I don't remember him being this bad from the back of the court. Now, that did change in the summer. Toronto and Cincinnati, both times he lost super tight matches to Alcaraz, in which, honestly, from the back of the court, it seemed like he could not have played any better than he did. Obviously, throughout his career, the forehand has blown super hot and cold. Seemed poised to do really well in New York, but early exit there. But then the Hurkacz roller coaster went back up at the end of the year with the title in Shanghai. So, I don't really know how to evaluate his year. He continues to be just one of the most dumbfounding players to evaluate in general. But for his year, just for that flurry at the end of the year, I'll go B-. And then rounding out the top 10, of course, we've got Taylor Fritz at the end. In many ways, he was even more consistent than his year last year, which saw him take his first and only big title in Indian Wells and also finish the year in Turin. But Taylor, I honestly do feel, he's kind of hit his ceiling. He made, I think, just his second slam quarterfinal at the US Open, but, he got blasted by Djokovic. And overall, he kind of continues to disappoint in majors, but just continues to chip away with just how much he plays throughout the year. And for the most part, remaining quite consistent, quite steady in those non-slam events. But other than that, nothing too noteworthy this year. I'd say it's just a pretty standard C+ year. And so that brings me to now my predictions for the top 10 at the end of this year. So let's just kick it off up top at number 1. I'm picking Carlos Alcaraz this year to finish the year number 1. I was going to predict Alcaraz to be number 1 at the end of 2023, and I didn't because pulling the plug on Australia obviously set him back quite a bit. But I think the difference is he can just play more than Djokovic at this point. Novak may still have a better year than him, but at 36 going on 37, obviously Djokovic can play less, and he wants to play less. He wants to peak for the slams and the slams only. And you saw even this year, Alcaraz having missed Australia, Djokovic winning 3 slams. After the US Open, it was still in Alcaraz's hands for who finishes number 1 pretty much. This year, Carlos seems ready to go to play Australia, and obviously he's a guy where the sky's the limit. He is a threat already, top 2 favorite as we stand pretty much at every single slam. Just being younger, I think he has the upper hand here on Novak, so I'll go him to finish 2024 number 1, Novak to finish number 2. Obviously, Djokovic showing no signs of slowing down. Again, I'm not putting him at number 2 because I see him being surpassed, I see him being passed by. He very well could have the better year and still finish number 2. And I don't really think, especially in an Olympics year this year, finishing number 1 is going to be that much of a priority. He shattered the week's record, he shattered the year-end finishes at number 1 record. Pretty self-explanatory there. Number 3, I think also pretty self-explanatory. I'm going Sinner. I don't consider Sinner's end-of-the-year surge to be fake or fraudulent. As many others have said, this seems like the first year that Sinner's truly ready physically, mentally, everything's there for him to actually be able to win a major. Whether or not he actually does it, I just think that his drive to improve his coaching team and his trajectory as far as where he is with his game at this time, he seems poised to back up, all this hype that's behind him now. Number 4, Medvedev. He remains one of the top 3 players and part of that first tier of guys on the most prevalent surface on tour and hard courts. You're always going to get a boatload of points for that. And Medi's also beginning to acclimate a lot better to the natural surfaces than he has in the past. He remains a super tough out. I have no question he'll continue to be a top 5 player. It really just comes down to a select few matchups for him against elite opposition as far as questions moving forward, but he'll be just fine. Number 5, I'm going Zverev. It was a super slow start in 2023. Shouldn't be the case this year. And again, I just think that, him being such a consistent year-round performer everywhere except for grass, I think that pretty much does the trick of getting him back to the top 5. Just missing out on the cut of the top 5, I'll go Rune at number 6. Probably the biggest wild card of the bunch here. Holger pretty much just has to figure it out physically, and even if he doesn't, he is good for one just tear of a stretch during the season. Number 7, Andrei Rublev. Obviously, the questions are still there of, can he beat the best of the best? Does he have enough to win a major? But as far as staying amongst the world's best, I have no questions about that. I can't after last year. He's just another fabulous year-round performer. There's no reason to think that'll change. Andrei Rublev at number 7. Number 8. I thought long and hard about this one. I'm going Rafael Nadal. As a die-hard fan of this guy, trust me, I've been watching him for over a decade, and this is the first time, aside from, after 2016, where I actually thought that he was done. This is the only other time I'm coming into a season with just zero expectations off a comeback. Every time he's, come back off these injury layoffs, which has very much been a theme throughout the course of his career. It's been a very start and stop nature to it. But every time before an injury, aside from that 2015-2016 stretch, he was still playing good enough tennis to where, I thought, doesn't seem like he's done. If the body can recuperate, then there's no reason to think he can't get back to that pre-injury level. I thought that every time. I thought that early 2013, coming off the 2012 break. I thought that throughout his injuries in 2018, 2019, and then again, documented on this channel at the beginning of 2022 off the 2021 break when a lot of people were writing him off. This time, however, is obviously different. He hasn't played good tennis since July of 2022. Obviously, he was excellent in 2022, all the way up through Wimbledon. And when he came back after Wimbledon, the latest action we have of Rafa is him posting some of the worst results of his career in that run from 2022 North America to 2023 Australia. Ever since he broke through on tour, we have never seen him losing at that clip. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is he will be coming off a full year, basically off at 37 going on 38. And all this points to this one being the toughest comeback yet. So why do I have him at number 8? I was not planning on having him on this list until I actually saw him practicing in Brisbane. Honestly, mainly just because he looks as fit as he has in a really long time. I think arguably since before the pandemic. Really seems like Rafa has worked hard to give himself the best shot he can in this, potential last dance. And secondly, and probably more importantly, I just feel like a player of his caliber, of his skill set, with these GOAT tier guys, I just don't think the tennis skills are ever going to really go anywhere. And given that, I just feel it all comes down to how far the body is willing to cooperate. And obviously, given this prediction, I'm erring on the side of optimism as far as the body's concerned. I do genuinely feel like if the body is willing to come along for the ride, Rafa will be great. It is a little bit of a leap of faith. Right now, we don't really know anything. You gotta go off the gut. We will see as it goes as far as the answer to that question regarding his body. But regardless, it'll be fabulous to have Rafa back on tour. Number 9, Tsitsipas. As I said, I feel like he has stagnated. Almost assuredly, a great clay court season again will undo this prediction. Rafa also a little bit of a wild card, but right now I'm just more confident in those first 7 guys right now finishing above Tsitsipas, especially those first 6. So who knows, maybe flying under the radar will suit Tsitsipas. We'll have to wait and see. Number 10, I'll go Casper Ruud. For Casper, I think there's nowhere to go but up. Aside from Roland Garros this year, his year was really mediocre. Even on his favorite clay, he was subpar for his standards. And while, last year I felt that he wasn't, a number 2, number 3 worthy player, I also don't think the real him is closer to what we saw throughout the course of this year. He may not make the major final this year, but I'm definitely expecting more consistent results from him. I anticipate him more resembling, his 2021 self and making his way back into the top 10. And just to wrap it up, put a bow on top, I'm also going to throw in my slam winners for this year. Obviously, this will probably be subject to change once I actually see these draws as each of the majors happen, but to start the year, my gut says you can't go against Djokovic in Australia, hasn't lost since 2018. I'm going to say the rain down under keeps on chugging. For Roland Garros and Wimbledon, even though Djokovic won Roland Garros and Alcaraz won Wimbledon, each of them beating each other to do so, heading into each of those tournaments, and if those rematches happened again this year, I would back Alcaraz at Roland Garros and I would back Djokovic at Wimbledon. Obviously at Roland Garros, Rafa the big wild card there. A half-decent Nadal probably wins that title, but you can't bank on that, and, at his age, best of 5 on clay for the first time in his career may not actually favor him. So I'll go Alcaraz at Roland Garros, Djokovic at Wimbledon, and then Alcaraz again at the US Open, a 2-2 split for the year. And as I said before, there will be 2 big events held on Roland Garros clay this year, and while the main event, Roland Garros, may not favor Nadal anymore in best of 5, it may be an equally daunting task this year to take him down in an event that really matters at the Olympics in best of 3. So I will go Rafa Nadal to win his 2nd Olympic gold medal. Thank you all for watching. 2023 was a blast again on the channel, and it's early days in 2024, but we are definitely in for a treat. And quite simply, it is great to have tennis back again.